Coming up on Capital Crossfire, the war in Ukraine ravages on. The 2022 midterms are 7 months away, and new abortion laws in Oklahoma and Florida. Joining us from the left, Amanda Brauchler, and on the right, Emily Thomas. And I'm your moderator, Jessica Nix. From the GWTV studios in Washington, D.C., this is Capital Crossfire. On this season of Capital Crossfire, we have covered the war in Ukraine extensively, and that is where we start this episode. We've seen more stories of attacks on civilians and human rights violations as the Russian army retreats to regroup. Ukraine is holding their own as Russia begins to re-strategize in the country. Russia has retreated from the suburbs of Kyiv, but could the retreat from Kyiv be a moment of reprieve before another large-scale attack? Our panel is here to discuss that and more. On the left, Amanda Brauchler, a freshman majoring in international affairs and economics. Amanda is from Littleton, Colorado. And on the right, Emily Thomas, a freshman from Peabody, Massachusetts. Emily is majoring in business and finance and is the director of marketing for College Republicans. Thank you both for joining us today. We'll start the debate with the war in Ukraine. Russia is retreating, but it looks like they are regrouping to concentrate forces on the Eastern Front. As Russia retreats, news of human rights violations are compounding. In the town of Bucha, mass graves have been found. In Mariupol, children were attacked in a theater. Recently, President Joe Biden accused Russian President Vladimir Putin of genocide. So, Emily, I'm going to go to you for the first question. What should the U.S. do about combating Russia's violence, and how should NATO respond? I know the U.S. has called for the International Criminal Court to investigate Putin, but is there more that can be done?
Well, I certainly think that Putin should be investigated for the war crimes because rape is a national war crime, as well as things such as, it's kind of common courtesy, don't go after children, don't go after mothers, don't go after hospitals and schools, and Putin is doing just that. Although he declines it in many instances, the evidence speaks for itself. However, I do stand true to the statement that I think that the U.S., there's no need for the U.S. to get involved. This is between Russia and Ukraine, and I understand a lot of awful things are happening, but that is between the two countries themselves. There's no need for the U.S. to get involved and deploy our troops and have our troops go frontline and end up getting killed just because it's not our war to fight. And then as for NATO, I think that I know Ukraine was trying to get involved in NATO and be in NATO. However, with that being said, they never officially were entered into NATO, so as of right now, NATO has no legal obligation to help them.
So, Amanda, what can the U.S. and NATO do to combat these human rights violations?
I agree in large part with Emily. I think it's more than just common courtesy not to bomb hospitals and kill children. That's an atrocity. That's a war crime. That is definitely something under the purview of the ICC, and the ICC should go after Putin for these atrocities and these war crimes. More than that, there's no Article 5 protection from NATO for Ukraine. As Emily pointed out, Ukraine's not a part of NATO, so we can't do anything there, and this is not our fight to pick. This is not our battle with Putin to pick. Our economic sanctions are continuing to ravage Russia's economy as they continue to do, and we need to levy those harder. Europe needs to continue to back these economic sanctions, which are taking a toll on Russia. And more than that, we can provide resources in neighboring countries like Poland or other NATO countries where there's 4 million Ukrainian refugees going to. We can provide resources for people that are victims of these war crimes and displacement. And that is really where our role should come in as NATO countries and as the United States.
So diplomatic talks with Russia are fraught at this point. So here is Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky on 60 Minutes about diplomatic talks.
I'm no longer interested in their diplomacy that leads to the destruction of my country. A lot of countries have changed their mind about Ukraine and about our people, but I think we've paid too high a price for that.
So Amanda, going off of that quote from Zelensky, Putin knows he's losing, so he's restructuring and putting in a new general for their strategy. Russia is restructuring their attack strategy with a new general now that Putin knows that he is losing. Can Ukraine keep their own, or will Putin eventually tire out the country since diplomacy seems to have minimal effects?
I think it's an unfortunate situation for Ukraine. They're not put in a good situation. I think against Russia and Russia's forces, they don't really stand a chance. With Putin levying new forces against Ukraine, it's not looking good. They can continue to hold their own. As Zelensky said, diplomacy is not enough. I would agree if I was Zelensky. But from a NATO and United States perspective, diplomacy is all we have to offer. We have our economic sanctions against Russia, which have been hurting them and causing them to restructure this war. And we also have the resources that we can provide as NATO states to other NATO states. There's armament coming in from Germany to Ukraine, from other NATO states. That's all we have to give to Ukraine, because this is not our fight to pick. But if that fight lands on our doorstep, that comes to Poland or attacks any other NATO country, that is then our fight to pick, and then we will levy forces against Putin. But unfortunately, diplomacy is all we have to give.
Emily?
Absolutely, I agree with you 100%. Like you said, if they go to our doorsteps and they go to any country that's involved in NATO, then absolutely, I stand true to my statement that we should get involved. I agree with that. The diplomacy is all that we have to offer. Last time I said that I thought Ukraine would have been done within 2 days to a week. However, I was absolutely wrong. Ukraine has done an incredible job of standing their own. I know a ton of civilians are dying and it's awful, but I think that Ukraine has been able to hold their own, and Putin now knows that he's losing. I know he's deploying troops eastern, but hopefully he kind of pulls back on that, especially with the Australian president going to speak with him. I know other European presidents or European officials have been speaking to him, telling him he's essentially going to lose. So I think if Ukraine stands true to what they're doing and what they've been doing, that they could very easily pull out and win.
So chemical weapons are also an obvious concern as Russia is re-strategizing. So Emily, should the U.S. draw a red line like Obama did in Syria if Russia resorts to chemical weapons? Or would chemical weapons even rally public support behind troop deployment?
I don't necessarily think so. I mean, certainly if they get involved with chemical weapons, it would be a more deadly outcome. But if, again, this is between Russia and Ukraine, and there's no need for us to deploy troops and have our men and women die on the front line for a war that isn't our own. But again, if they ended up invading Poland or a NATO country, then that is our fight to battle.
Amanda?
I would have to agree. I think we're at a stalemate here when it comes to our involvement in the Ukraine-Russia fight, just because of the nature of the fight. We're two great powers, both great powers with huge nuclear weapons. We have 90% of the nuclear weapons between us and Russia in the entire world, and that makes the cost of us entering this war too great for a war that is not ours to fight. These chemical weapons being used against the people of Ukraine, that is a war crime, and that is something the ICC will go after, and continuing to hurt Russia through those economic sanctions and making it difficult for them to continue to go on and delegitimizing Putin's power from his own people, that is the best thing that we can do in this situation.
There are companies that have also refused to keep serving Russia, including social media companies. Russians cannot access Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok, which is leading to larger propaganda issues within the country. Russia is also pushing anti-Ukrainian content on social media, while citizens have no access to any independent source. Across the world, many people are seeing scenes from the front lines via TikTok and other social media platforms. So Amanda, I'm going to give this one to you first. Social media companies refusing service to Russia will obviously lead to increasing propaganda in the country, but how has it helped Ukraine's cause? And how has public perception changed because of social media?
Well, of course, I think we've seen a lot of social media support for Ukraine, and that's where most of the support comes from when it comes to the general zeitgeist talking about Ukraine, both here and from what we can see from the front lines, as you pointed out, from Ukraine. I think being able to see on your For You page, shrouded in Charli D'Amelio and other trends like that, video from the front lines is pretty powerful and reminds people what is actually going on and the actual toll that this is going on. Again, that leads with misinformation and things like that too, but the fact that Ukraine has such a foothold when it comes to social media in the Western world and just in general, because they are allowed to be on social media, is good for that country and for rallying for global support for them. I think everyone stands pretty much united against Russia in this.
So Emily, are people more empathetic to Ukraine because of social media like TikTok?
I think so, but I also think that before the war happened and before Russia officially invaded, I think people were still standing behind Ukraine before it and had a huge social media impact, just because people were looking at the facts and people were looking at Putin's reasonings to go to war, which were kind of unethical. There was no need to go to war. It was just Putin wanted to be Putin. So I think social media certainly did have an impact, but at the same time, before leading into the war, I think people were already backing Ukraine. I know all Democrats and Republicans were backing Ukraine from the start. So, I mean, I think it's certainly a mix of both. And I think that, like you said, there's been a consensus all over social media that everyone's backing up Ukraine. And I know Russia is kind of blocking Russians from seeing that. But I know a few Russians who are like, this is ridiculous. I think that's a consensus throughout most of Russia. I know there are some people who don't agree or who believe that the war was necessary, but for the most part, I think most of the world stands with Ukraine.
So that's going to wrap up our conversation on Russia and Ukraine. I'm really glad we could find some consensus here with that point. When we come back, it's midterm season. Stay with us.
Hi, Colonials. Did you know there are hundreds of ways for you to volunteer with GW? Each year, over 1,500 alumni, parents, and friends contribute thousands of hours to make our community stronger. There are countless ways you can volunteer, so it's easy to choose an opportunity that is most meaningful to you, like connecting with students and alumni based on your student involvement, identity, or personal interests. Getting involved with your local alumni network. Mentoring a current student via our online mentoring platform. Connecting with prospective students through undergraduate admissions opportunities. Serving on an industry network leadership council. Becoming a social media ambassador. The list goes on. No matter where you are in the world or how much time you have to give, you can connect and volunteer with GW. And the best part, it's easy to get involved. Just visit alumni.gwu.edu/volunteer to learn more about these and other opportunities. Because of your service to GW, you are able to make a direct impact on the lives of former, current, and future students. We look forward to working with you. Raise high.
The 2022 midterms are a mere 7 months away. The primaries are on the horizon and races are getting contentious. Both Democratic and Republican candidates seem to be embracing the extreme sides of their parties rather than running as moderates. On the Republican side, it looks like only one person's opinion matters, and he lives in Mar-a-Lago. The Trump endorsement is highly sought after, and for someone who likes to win, Trump isn't giving it to just any candidate. While he has endorsed over 100 Republican candidates up and down the ballot, candidates who refuse to acknowledge the 2020 election results are keeping the endorsement. In Alabama, Congressman Mo Brooks had the endorsement locked in for almost a year until he started to lose in the polls in fundraising and suggested it's time to move on from 2020. Trump has since rescinded his endorsement. In Pennsylvania, Dr. Oz scored the endorsement for the Senate because Trump likes his TV experience. In Georgia, Trump endorsed former Senator David Perdue over Governor Brian Kemp. Perdue's entire campaign is based on the 2020 election. Headed into the primaries, Republicans will soon see whether they need to embrace Trump or if Republican voters are ready to move on. So Amanda, I'm going to go to you first. Wyoming's Liz Cheney recently raised $3 million in the first quarter this year, so moderates still have some traction within the party. Is the Trump endorsement the golden ticket for Republican candidates to win, or could we see more voters move away from Trump?
Look, as someone on the left who really wants my side to do well, I'm going to say this is the golden ticket. Have Trump keep endorsing you, because in the long term, for the longevity and the health of the Republican Party, Trump is ravaging that party and tearing it apart at the seams. So you know what? I'm going to say it's the golden ticket. I'm going to say go ahead, get that Trump endorsement. Keep doing your thing, baby.
Emily, same question. Golden ticket?
I mean, it's certainly, in the past we've had former presidents endorse candidates. However, I know as a Republican, Trump is not the best. Sure, I stand behind some of his policies, but his overall moral character is kind of lacking. And I think a lot of people, Trump has certainly ruined the Republican stigma, and people will, if it's kind of detrimental to go out in society nowadays and say, hey, I'm a Republican, because they sit and think like, oh, you're a Trumpy, things like that. It has a bad stigma. So I think if Trump, we need to slowly move away from the 2020 election. We need to move away from Trump being president. I don't think he's going to run in 2024. I hope not, just because our party needs to recover. And sure, Trump can go out and endorse his candidates, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the golden ticket. And I think some candidates might be better off not having him endorse them, because it moves away from the stigma of being a Trumpy and things like that.
So Emily, going into the midterms, who has control of the GOP, Trump or more moderates?
Probably Trump's. But I think it would be better if we had more moderates, because I think both sides, moving forward, we both need to agree and kind of become closer in our policies and not go to the extremes lefts and the extremes rights. So I wish it was more moderate, but I think it's more Republican right-leaning.
So Amanda, who has control of the Democratic Party? Biden, who doesn't really seem to have a defined base, or more progressives?
I don't think Biden has a super defined base, but he's not Trump. And that's kind of what he ran on last, not by choice, but just by nature of the party. I think that more of those moderates are hopefully having a sway in a poll for Biden, because if the Democratic Party wants to take this opportunity for what it is, which is a bunch of people leeching from the Republican Party and becoming moderates, they should enact more policies that lean to them and start sweeping them up to get that support in the midterms and do well.
This is also the first year that Gen Z can run. People born after 1996 are eligible for public office, and for Congress, there are two candidates on opposite sides of the political spectrum. Maxwell Frost in Florida is running as a progressive, while Caroline Leavitt in New Hampshire is running as a pro-Trump Republican. In the 2020 election, younger voters also had a very high turnout for a demographic that is known to not be politically active. So, Amanda, how will Gen Z have an impact on the midterms in terms of voter turnout and in terms of elected office?
I think finally we're seeing more Gen Z participation, like you pointed to, Jess. I promoted a bunch of rallies for Biden during the election season last year in Colorado that had a lot of Gen Z turnout, which was crazy because that's unprecedented for the time. I think that once we realize the foothold that we have in the country and the population that we are when it comes to swinging the votes, that'll be an unprecedented move, hopefully in sway of the Democrats, to help us from Gen Z. But I think that political participation in this information and want to be part of this this election and process is good for the health of democracy. So overall, it's great.
So Emily, what impact could Gen Z have on the midterms?
I absolutely agree. I do agree that most of Gen Z is left-leaning, unfortunately. Maybe we'll change them one day, but I think it's great, regardless of Democrats or Republican. I think a lot of politicians are older now, and we need a new sway of younger people and a new sway of opinions, and having Gen Z being able to finally run and get involved in politics, I think it's great, regardless of the party. I think that we finally need some new opinions and we need new motives, and I think it's certainly great that we're starting to be able to get involved and have our own policies. And I know that Jessica said that Gen Z isn't really politically active, but I think with current events going on, people are becoming more aware of what's going on, and they are getting aggravated of what's going on. They want to get involved, and I think that's great, and hopefully we'll see a good outcome with the 2022 midterm elections for both candidates who are running.
And that will be the last word. Up next, Rapid Fire. We'll be right back.
Universities like George Washington play a critical role in hosting debate and discourse on events of the day.
The right answer is not to refuse the other. The right answer is not to say, get rid of this religion. It's not part of us. It's wrong.
I think that the story of America is the story of race. So when I think of the questions that I'm asking or the stories that I'm going to write, I'm thinking, okay, well, what are we learning about our country?
Well, I think the likelihood of him being indicted is close to 100%. There was a lot of hurdles that had to be cleared in order for that to happen.
One of the reasons that Donald Trump is president is because there is such a frustration with the way that Washington functions.
Sympathy is one thing, but empathy is the language of recovery, and it's something that's without a doubt instilled into every person that's in recovery.
It's never lead with the positive, it's always lead with the perceived negative.
Well, that is part of the problem. I mean, I actually would agree with you on that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. One of the things that we have seen that is most under siege in this country is the notion of civil discourse, and we here at GW, among other things, very much want to stand for that.
This is truly an only at GW moment.
Welcome back to Rapid Fire. Some quick answers to some quick questions. Oklahoma recently passed an all-out ban on abortions in the state, with the exception for abortions performed to save the life of the mother. Anyone convicted of performing an abortion can face 10 years in prison and $100,000 fine. Governors in Kentucky and Florida signed similar laws into effect just days ago. And states are accelerating their pressure on the Supreme Court to re-examine Roe v. Wade. So, Emily, I'm going to go to you first. Similar laws in Alabama and Arkansas were struck down. So is there anything different with Florida and Oklahoma laws? And how could we see the Supreme Court react to these?
Well, I certainly think that Roe v. Wade is in the future of getting overturned. I think with the Supreme Court being mostly right-leaning and who right-leaning people are against abortion, I certainly see it being overturned. As for Florida and Oklahoma, I absolutely agree with the with the laws, I think that we need to protect child's lives with everything that we can, because we're going into a day and age where people kind of joke about abortion, which I don't think is a funny topic. We have children's heartbeats are consumed at there's a visible heartbeat at 5 to 6 weeks. Brain function is beginning to form at 5 to 6 weeks and is fully functioning at 12 weeks. As of right now, worldwide, we're at 12 million abortions, which is just disgusting in my opinion. So I think we certainly, these states are moving in a right direction in my opinion, and I think that, I know there's going to be backlash from the left-leaning and from other left-leaning states, but I think if Roe v. Wade gets overturned, there's going to be a lot more of this coming in our direction.
So Amanda, Oklahoma and Florida are joining states like Texas and Mississippi whose laws are already being challenged in the Supreme Court. So how will the Supreme Court react to even new cases that could pop up?
Look, these should be challenged. Roe v. Wade establishes abortion and private health care in that sense as a constitutional right. And this is a matter of health care. Truly, abortion is a matter of health care. And what these laws do is make the week cutoff so low that it renders abortion pretty much illegal. The other two scary things that I want to point out about these laws are, especially for Oklahoma and Florida, which were safe states or haven states for a bunch of women from Texas and from places that have already had abortion bans or effective abortion bans, that this now leaves a healthcare crisis in those two states and then puts pressure on other states and other clinics in places like Colorado, my home state, that just became a safe haven for abortion, and other states in the area, creating a health crisis where women have to flee to go get the medical care that they seek. The other problem with these bills is that Oklahoma has another ban that they're trying to pass for abortion, and just like Texas is banned, it has a vigilante clause, which means that your neighbor or someone next to you or someone that you know, if they know that you were aiding and abetting someone in receiving an abortion, or if you're a doctor that's giving abortion care, that they can report you. They're weaponizing people and enabling people in communities to go after each other. That's just not American, and that's just not democratic. And that's what's scary about these bans too.
Now, I have a question. You say it's health care, but is deciding if a child should live or not, deciding to kill it or not, you say that's health care? Why would that be health care? I don't comprehend, no offense, I just don't comprehend the left-leaning moral value as to deciding whether you should kill a baby or not.
It is health care.
But why? You're killing a baby. That's not health care. That's not promoting life. That's killing something that's living, or will be living very shortly.
The Republican Party is not pro-life, it is pro-birth. If they were pro-life, they would be giving more care and more access to neonatal care. They would be giving more education and primary education to people. They'd be giving more support to single mothers and young mothers. They'd be giving more social programs so that people who are forced and put into a horrible situation where they have to choose between themselves and their livelihood and potentially the livelihood of a child that they are conceiving and having, they need to make that decision easier, because that is truly the way to fight abortion, is to make that decision easier. So that's why it's a healthcare need too, especially when it comes to these mothers that have to go through that psychological trauma, sometimes that's physical trauma in cases of rape or incest. That's healthcare to get rid of that fetus that is a product of that, if that is the woman's choice. And a woman has a right to make that option about her body.
Okay, I just have one more statement. You claim that the one thing that I do disagree with my party on is, before we hopefully universally ban abortion or make limits of 5 weeks, 6 weeks, 10 weeks, 15, I do think that we need to fix the foster care system, because there are instances where rape and incest occur and the mother doesn't want to fulfill the pregnancy, but if there are laws in place, they're going to have to, which is, you know, we shouldn't just kill innocent children, but I do think that we need to fix the foster care system and provide more funding, make it an easier process to go about adopting children. I think that should be one of the first priorities of happening before we universally ban abortion. And I do agree that my party has some flaws, but I still think it comes down to the life or death. It's a woman's choice, but it's not, because sure, the woman is fulfilling the pregnancy, fulfilling the birth, but that child is still its own human being. It doesn't have a voice, it doesn't have a say. So you say that it's a woman's choice, but it's not really, because it's not its body.
So Emily, then is it the government's choice to make that decision for the woman? Because that's who's stepping in.
Well, the government makes laws. I couldn't go out and just kill you for fun. So it's the same thing for a child. I can't go out and just kill a child. There are laws in place, and there are laws to protect a human life, whether it's in the womb or outside of the womb.
Look, this isn't a cavalier situation. As you said, this isn't a joke. So we shouldn't treat it like it's a willy-nilly decision that women have to take on. It's not a like, oh, I messed up, didn't use contraception, I'm gonna go get an abortion. Abortion isn't contraception, and most women don't treat it that way, and it should be painted in that light. Instead, it is healthcare. It is healthcare for that woman. Also, as a party that doesn't support a lot of government intervention when it comes to things, especially like poverty, like foster care, or anything like that, it's kind of crazy that you support government intervention when it comes to a woman making a healthcare decision for herself.
It's a government interventing a human life. That's the difference.
What about the human life of that woman that would be upended from that pregnancy, or the decision that is hers to make because it's her fetus, that isn't a life yet because it's not born. It is still attached to her and still being fed by her and still a part of her until it is
It's a
birthed.
part of her, but the baby, it's its own human being. It has a heartbeat at 5 weeks. It has fully functioning brain functions at anywhere from 12 to 16 weeks. There are preemies who ended up coming out and they fight like hell, and they ended up becoming humans themselves, like fully, they've ended up fighting and becoming actual humans and going about things, and just deciding that claiming that it's healthcare, it's not. It's killing a human being. That's what abortion simply is.
It still takes that woman's body to birth and conceive that fetus and carry that out full term. It is her decision. It is still a part of her until it is actually a separate being and separate entity from her. And I think we should go back to the bans that are happening in these states. I think that these states recognize that with a Republican majority on the Supreme Court, this could finally be their time. They've been waiting in the weeds, trying to overturn Roe v. Wade and test the constitutionality of Roe v. Wade. And I don't think that that should happen. I think that would cause a huge crisis when it comes to healthcare in the area and the health of women and just the status of our country when it comes to the ability and mobility for women, and also just with government intervention in that topic. And I think the other scary thing about these bans that you didn't touch on yet, Emily, is that the fact that they recruit a vigilante force of seeking out people that aid and abet abortions and making then your neighbor almost like a police officer against you, looking for those in Texas, and then there's also one coming through in Oklahoma that would enable that. That's not very democratic.
Well, I mean, the same policies. If I went and killed you and I told someone, they're going to report it to the police. It's no different than that if you go out and kill a child.
But it doesn't just make you complicit in that murder. It's not just the mother. It then makes the doctor and anyone else in that abortion complicit. The person that drove the woman to Planned Parenthood or the hospital, anyone else that was on the phone with her giving those abortion pills. All of those people then could be sought out for aiding and abetting in this abortion, and I don't think that's right.
But you're still aiding and abetting someone being killed, a child being killed. It's the same policy as if a human being was standing right next to me or there was a human in my fetus. It's the same exact policies.
I still think it's scary that we are enabling a vigilante force of neighbors against each other in a democracy. That's not very democratic.
So we're going to wrap up that debate right there and move on to our next topic. A subvariant of Omicron, the COVID variant, is now the dominant strain in the U.S. Cases are rising, but hospitalizations are still stable. The U.S. is nearing 1 million deaths due to COVID-19. In Washington, D.C., over 70 high-profile people have tested positive at the annual Gridiron Dinner. Philadelphia has reinstated their mask mandate. College campuses, including GW, are requiring masks in classrooms again. And the CDC has extended masks on transportation through May 3rd. So, Amanda, I'm going to give you this one first. Most Americans believe COVID is something we have to live with. And as we saw in November 2021 elections, Americans are tired of masking. With this flip-flopping and the new variant, how does the country unite on the issue?
I think flip-flopping from masking is making it increasingly harder to encourage masks, but we know what works. We've been going through this for almost 2 years now, and we understand the facts and the science, and we have the data behind it. And what works is masking and protecting our communities in that sense, and vaccinating. If you don't feel like masking, try and vaccinate, and continuing to support and have government support for outside R&D that creates new vaccines and new boosters. Our communities need to be vaccinated, we need to reach herd immunity, and we need to continue to take boosters for as long as the CDC tells us so that we don't allow for new variants.
So, Emily, many in Washington are still encouraging masking when most Americans are ready to move on. So how does the country unite when it seems like Washington is almost out of touch?
I mean, I think the country has not united on this topic for at least a year out of the 2 years of COVID. you know, there's always going to be new variances. There's new variances with the flu every single year. We've learned to live with the flu. I think that we really need to learn to live with COVID. Sure, people are dying, but people die from the flu every year. We need to treat this as what it is. It's a different variant of the flu. People are going to die, but it sounds inhumane, but people are going to die from the flu as well. There's some sicknesses that we can't overcome. And with symptoms as of like a runny nose or a cough or a sore throat, that's not life or death entirely. So, you know, if people are vaccinated, we don't have to wear masks. Same thing for GW. The whole campus is double vaccinated and boosted, and yet there was a slight increase in cases, and yet we have to mask up again. This flip and flop back and forth, it seems as if this country is never going to unite on a topic like this because, you know, we look to the government for support and help, and yet they can't even make their own decisions. So, I mean, this whole topic, it's getting aggravated for the world. We need to move on.
I think we can't treat it like the flu, though. Not yet, at least. We've been living with the flu for centuries, and we've had vaccines for the flu for a long time, too, and those have become a routine part of annual checkups and things that kids have to get in order to come to school. There's still a lot of contention when it comes to COVID vaccines and boosters, and as a scientific community, as a government, and as a population, we're still trying to decide if we need more boosters, if that's a viable option for fighting this pandemic, is continuing to boost every single year, just like a flu shot. And so before we get to that point of complicity when it comes to this pandemic and treating it like, oh, well, it'll be a couple deaths. It's over 900,000 deaths in this country, and it's highly contagious, it's highly infectious, and every new variant seems to be more and more contagious. So I think that we should treat it with the same severity that we were treating it with 6 months ago, which is continuing to mask and continuing to boost. And we shouldn't start yet treating it like the flu, because it's not at that point yet.
No, I understand. Like, if you asked me a year ago, I understood the mask mandates and trying to protect people. But a year or 2 years ago or to a year and a half ago, it was extremely deadly. I completely understood where they were coming from. However, now it's just a sore throat or a cough. And things like that, as it becomes mostly scientifically, as if a disease becomes more contagious, it's less deadly. So sure, it's going to keep evolving and become more contagious, but it's going to also become less deadly. So in my mindset, the BA2 or the BA1, this is a step in the right direction. This is great because less people are dying from this deadly disease that 2 years ago was killing pretty much everyone well, not everyone, but a lot of people who were getting it. So as we move on into the future, we need to adapt with it, and this is it being more contagious and it being less deadly. It's a step in the right direction, and we also need to abide by that and let people return to their normal lives of going back to school or going back to the office or not having to wear a mask wherever they go. And it just seems as if schools like GW and public transportations aren't comprehending that we need to move on with the world, and we need to move on and adapt. And by reinstating the mask mandates and requiring boosters at every single instance, it seems that we're not getting to that.
I would agree that it's a good sign that the variants are showing that it's less and less contagious, but it's also because we have the science to fight this thing. And also, I don't think we should yet be so comfortable with the pandemic, kind of like I was saying before. This is not something where we can move on. This is not something where the world has moved on. We in the United States have the luxury of having the vaccine infrastructure and the science and data to distribute vaccines to people, and yet we still decide not to vaccinate. There are entire countries and populations that have not yet received the vaccine. This isn't something that the world can just move on from yet, because the world hasn't yet all been vaccinated. That is something we can play a role in as a country by spreading vaccines out. But also, we need to realize that we can't just put our shoes back on and head back outdoors and leave our mask behind. That's not something we can do. I think that we need to realize, too, that as this gets more contagious, it's not just you and me going out that get infected, and it's just a cough and a sneeze. For us, it's our elderly populations, and it's other people that have health risks and things like that, where it's less safe for them to go outside as we keep partying and keep spreading it in between each other, because it's still contagious for them and still exacerbates the underlying conditions that they have. And we need to get to a point where it doesn't become a crisis every single time we have a surge in hospitals where hospital beds are taken up. So until it reaches a point where we are safe and we can continue to sneeze on each other and infect each other, and there's no cause, no deadliness, and no surge in hospital cases, I think we still need to treat this with the severity it demands.
But there's never going to be a time where this COVID or this disease isn't going to kill people. But as the numbers...
I'm not saying not kill people in general, I'm saying make it make it like the flu, render it almost inconsequential in that sense, where it's contagious, but it's not deadly to most people. And it's not at that point yet. And it's not at that point where it doesn't continue to put people in the hospital and exacerbate underlying
But the flu puts people in the hospital as well. So I mean, I
not
just
to the extent of COVID.
But it still puts people in the hospital. And
Sure.
as this disease is evolving, it's becoming more contagious, but it's less deadly. So people are getting it and then getting the antibodies, and they're fine.
So I think we're in agreement. We're on the right track, but we're not there yet.
But but there's no need for masks and locking ourselves up and not continuing normal life. There's diseases throughout the world, whether it's COVID or the flu or HIVs. It's just people, you have to learn to live with them. And we're at a point in time where we haven't learned to live with them. It's just...
Yeah, I'm sorry. You're so
Sorry.
fine. I'm just going to cut you off right there, and we're going to move on to the January 6th committee. So the January 6th committee is still working with more and more information coming out about the insurrection and the lead up. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas's wife, Ginny Thomas, is also caught in the middle. Text messages between her and Trump's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, from before January 6th show Thomas talking about overthrowing the 2020 election. As the January 6th committee wraps up their investigation, they could be filing a few cases that make their way to the Supreme Court. So, Emily, I'm going to give you this first question. What ethical implications does Justice Thomas face with his wife's involvement, and how can Congress act?
So obviously, Justice Thomas, I don't think he should be held accountable for his wife's actions. I think his wife is a little out there, but I don't think that he should be held accountable for his wife's actions. His wife also texted Trump's chief of staff and just said that we need to help him out. It doesn't necessarily mean disrupt the 2020 election. It's kind of a misinterpretation, in my opinion. However, I think he should be able to vote. He's on the Supreme Court. He has certainly earned that duty, and I don't think he should be penalized for his wife's actions. I think his wife should be penalized for her actions. As a person, you can make your own decisions, and it shouldn't be who you're married to affect that.
Amanda, same question. What are the ethical implications for Thomas, and what should Congress do?
I agree for the most part with Emily. I'm saying thank God we're not saying Justice Ginny Thomas. That would be bad, clearly looking at the situation. I think that it allows us to, with this information, scrutinize Justice Thomas more closely. As we saw, he was the only one that made a public statement against giving away those documents for the initial January 6th commission. When that part of it did go to the Supreme Court, I think we can scrutinize that decision and we can look at it. And with the right checks and balances, if we have to, we can scrutinize him and make ethical implications or ask him to not rule on the case. But for the most part, I think we need to realize too that Justice Thomas was confirmed and went through a Senate, and we as an American populace and as the Senate during the time supported him and believed that he would be the best on the bench. And we believe that he could read the Constitution unbiasedly and how he was taught to, and would not be biased in that decision. So thank God it's not Justice Ginny Thomas. But I still think we should look closely at what his rulings are in regards to this, just in case there is some underlying influence.
Absolutely, I think that we should watch him, but I also don't think, as if he's staying true to the Constitution and ruling unbiasedly, then there's no need for him to step down and not rule on these actions. But if there is a point in time where people are viewing his opinions as biased, and that's something we certainly need to conduct, because the United States, we have a Supreme Court so that they can rule accordingly and not be biased. And if there is some form of bias, it's not fair to the American people.
And that is going to wrap up our final Capital Crossfire debate of the semester. Amanda Brauchler and Emily Thomas, thank you both for coming on the show today, and thank you for this lively debate. When we come back, Willow Hassan has your fact check.
Raise high. This isn't just our battle cry. It's our call, our challenge. Because when you were called to Washington, you were called to higher expectations, to a higher standard. We are called here to advance knowledge, to serve society, to change the world. Is that too lofty? Too aspirational? Is it simply too much to expect? Not if your classroom is a Smithsonian, the IMF, or on the doorstep of the Supreme Court. Not if you have access to the most hallowed institutions and formidable leaders. Not if you are given the tools to change minds, shape laws, influence entire fields of study, advance our way of life, change the course of history. From the nation's capital to the four corners of the earth, to far below the surface and far beyond our atmosphere. Here, unique opportunities, the ones that many people work much of their lives to get, are within your reach from the moment you arrive. This is where you find new pathways for preventing global epidemics, where your unexpected friend propels a new scientific movement forward. This is where you push forward as a team to break records and reach new heights. Where your classroom is 68 square miles of the most consequential land on Earth. This is where you will make it happen. This is the George Washington University, and what we make is history. So stand up, be bold, take risks, press on, push harder, raise high.
Welcome back. During our panel discussion, a team of fact checkers monitored our debate. Willow Hassan is here to fill us in on what we missed. Willow?
Thanks, Jessica. Our debaters came prepared for today's debate with few errors. However, some clarifications need to be made. Democrat Amanda Brauchler claimed that Oklahoma was trying to pass a bill that would deputize citizens to enforce abortion laws, like a law passed earlier this year in Texas. While Oklahoma's abortion law did have a similar provision originally, the version of the bill heading to the governor's desk does not have such a clause. Amanda also stated that Clarence Thomas was the only Supreme Court justice who made a public statement against releasing documents pertaining to the January 6th to Congress. While this is accurate, we should clarify that Thomas issued a dissenting opinion with the court, not a public statement. On the right, Emily Thomas claimed that there was relative consensus in Russia against the war in Ukraine. Estimates published by the Center for European Policy Analysis place Russian support for the war anywhere between 58% and 71%. However, the CEPA also states that, quote, the capacity of public opinion polls to accurately reflect sentiment in an increasingly authoritarian state is limited, especially during extreme crises like war, end quote. She also made some claims surrounding stages of fetal development, which we would like to clarify. Her claim that heartbeats begin at 6 weeks is roughly accurate, but her claim that full brain development is at 12 weeks is incorrect. Science shows that the brain slowly takes over bodily functions for the fetus between 15 and 26 weeks, and does little more until separating into two halves between 27 and 40 weeks. Finally, Emily also claimed that any disease becomes more contagious, it becomes less deadly. But our fact-checking team found that there is still no scientific consensus on this theory. And that's all today for the fact check. Back to you, Jessica.
Thanks, Willow. Well, that's all for this episode and this season of Capital Crossfire. Be sure to check us out online at www.gw-tv.com and follow us on Twitter and Instagram and like us on Facebook. I am sad to say that this is my last episode of Capital Crossfire. Thank you to everyone at GWTV, including our incredible leaders, Isabel, Sam, and Bella. Thank you to my executive producers, Jack and Kyle, and your dedication. And thank you to the Crossfire team. I wouldn't have wanted to spend the last 4 years covering politics with anyone else. I know I'm leaving Capital Crossfire in amazing hands. For all of us at GWTV, I'm Jessica Nix. Thanks for getting caught in the crossfire with us. We'll see you back here next time.